Hello, and thank you so much for joining us for our webinar this afternoon on Rethinking Science Intervention. So to kick us off, I'll introduce myself. My name is Emily Miller. My pronouns are she, her. Prior to InnerOrbit, I was a high school chemistry teacher in Minnesota, so that's where I'm from right now. And during my time in the classroom, I taught in our alternative learning program, I taught regular chem, I taught honors chem. So lots of different ways to teach a lot of different kids. During my time in the classroom, I also got to be a PLC data leader, which I love. I love data. And now I have the pleasure of partnering with districts to help them pilot and try out InnerOrbit. And my hot take is black coffee is the best morning drink. Give me no cream, give me no sugar. I just need my warm cup of black coffee to start my day. And then I can do fancy, fun coffee later. And I'll send it over to Erin.
Thanks, Emily. I do love black coffee as well, but it's starting to warm up where I am. So I might have to switch to iced coffee here soon. I don't know if you all are going through a heat wave as well. But welcome, everyone. So nice to meet you. My name is Erin Cook. My pronouns are she, her. My background is in elementary education, specifically special education services and instructional coaching, which was such a cool dual job together because you get to see all of the resources and strategies that support learners who might need different things, but actually those things help everybody in the classroom. And that's why I'm so excited to talk about intervention today. It's definitely part of my background. I have my doctorate in teacher schools and society. It's coming up on 4 years of being out of that program, which is how long I was in the program for. So that feels wild. It feels like a lifetime ago now. And my role with InnerOrbit and why I'm so excited to be with Emily today is I'm our Chief Customers Officer. So I get to support all of our teams that support all of our amazing educators all the way through exploring InnerOrbit to implementing to advocation. So a lot of the topics we talk about today are from a really high level of, seeing really amazing customers throughout the country think about intervention. And my hot take is you can be both a cat and a dog person. The world tells you you have to be one, but you can be both. I am both a cat and dog person. I have 2 cats named Jim and Pam, and then my dog named Luna for any fans of The Office out there. It's a little bit about me. And back to you, Emily.
I also agree that you can be a cat and dog person, and my dog is named Yoshi, and my cats are named Kirby and Zelda. So if you like Super Mario Brothers or the Super Mario World, you've got that too. All right. So for our webinar today, our objective is we're going to explore how intervention best practices apply to science specifically. And then from there, we're going to analyze InnerOrbit's new beta intervention activities to see how that can potentially help support intervention within science. We're hoping to be here for about 45 minutes today. First, we'll just quick talk about what is InnerOrbit in case you're new here. Then from there, we're going to just do a really quick recap on just some NGSS fundamentals before we dive in and get into some of the nitty gritty. And then we're going to talk about the Rethinking Science Intervention. So we're going to kind of think about what does intervention look like in science. Then we're going to talk about just at its core, what is intervention. And then we're going to talk about intervention for sense making, because that's kind of a nuanced way of thinking about intervention, but trying to get our students to be able to that 3-dimensional sense making within the NGSS. Then from there, we're going to segue into InnerOrbit's intervention beta activities, and we'll go through an example of what that looks like. And then we'll talk about, if you're interested, how you could explore those. And then we'll go ahead and we'll call it a day. And for all of you How I Met Your Mother fans out there, we're having an intervention about intervention. So like I mentioned, first, I just want to quick start off with just what is InnerOrbit. So we are an assessment platform. We have over 10,000 different items that are all phenomena based, and they're all aligned to the NGSS. You can use these to build high integrity 3D assessments that then give you meaningful and actionable student data. Our data can get really detailed and really get into the 3 dimensions of the NGSS. So then you can come up with targeted supports in order to help your students move further. We also really strive to make the NGSS more accessible for both you and your students through innovative approaches to sense making. So we look at sense making as kind of the end goal. And then we, within our site and within our questions, put in a lot of scaffolding with 1D and 2D and 3D questions. And then we offer a lot of supports and resources to our customers and to those who are interested to try to help them and their students tackle the NGSS. And the last thing is we provide guidance and supporting resources and professional development, much like the webinar we're doing right now, to help everybody reach their NGSS. So we really want to take what we've learned within our own time in the classroom and what we've learned our time here within InnerOrbit to help support you and your team to get you all where you want to go. And from there, Erin is actually going to drop a link in the chat right now. And this link is a pilot interest form. We'll talk a little bit more about this later, but if this is something that you might want to explore or learn more about, you can fill out this interest form and a member of our team will contact you and let you know some next steps about how you could give this a try. So now that we talked a little bit about who we are here at InnerOrbit. Like I said, I wanted to just kind of briefly review some of these NGSS fundamentals just because we're going to be using all the lovely acronyms today. So it's nice just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So we keep talking about three-dimensional. So three-dimensional learning, three-dimensional sense making. And this comes from the fact that all of the NGSS standards have three dimensions embedded within them. The first dimension that is going to be within every single standard is the DCI, or the disciplinary core idea. And this is the content that is embedded within the standard. So for example, this is a third grade standard. LS is life science, and this is like the fourth chunk of them, the third one down. The DCI, or the content that is within this standard, is this idea of adaptation. So that habitats can help organisms survive well or not well. So this would be the content we would teach our students, that habitats affect survival for different organisms. Then the next dimension that is going to be embedded within every standard is the science and engineering practice, or the SEP. And that is going to be the skill that is embedded within every standard. In this case, the SEP is constructing an argument with evidence. So we've kind of shifted from, it's not enough for students just to know that polar bears can't live in the desert. We now need students to be able to engage in argument from evidence and come up with evidence and then create an argument for why polar bears can't exist in the desert. And that's a big jump from initially just knowing content. So this is where, again, we're going to talk about some of these scaffoldings, and then more importantly, we're going to talk about the potential interventions that we can do to help students with these difficult skills. And then the last dimension that is layered within every standard is the cross-cutting concept, or the CCC. This is kind of how students think, or like the lens in which they would approach solving a problem or like looking at a situation. I also like to think these of just like fundamental science ideas that transcend grade level, content level, etc. In this case, it is cause and effect. So the idea that particular habitats cause organisms to survive well or not well. And for students to be proficient with a standard, they need to be able to use all three of these dimensions together to solve a problem or look at a situation all about a novel phenomena they've never seen before. Easy, right? Not so much. So what we've done here at InnerOrbit is we've really tried to create an approach to scaffold students to sense making and give you incremental data along the way to help support your students to get to sense making. So when you're on our site, the first type of question you're actually going to find is a one-dimensional question. This is a DCI only question or a content only question. This is like the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell type of question. Now, we do want to be able to move beyond this type of question in order to get to that three-dimensional sense making, but it's also crucial that our students know the content too that is embedded within the standard and that we teach it. So these questions serve to ensure that our students understand the content before we get into two-dimensional questions. Two-dimensional questions still have the content in them, but now we're layering one other standard or one other dimension at a time. So either the SEP or the cross-cutting concept. This gives students a chance to flex and practice these skills independently of one another. And then it also gives you incremental data to see which dimension your students may need more support with before we get to three-dimensional sense-making questions. So this is where we're trying to get to that proficiency piece for students to be able to incorporate all three dimensions together when they're looking at a novel phenomena in order to kind of analyze or figure out the situation or the problem that's occurring. So now that we've kind of refreshed ourselves with the three different dimensions and how they all come together into different problems, now we're really going to be launching into our topic today, which is all about rethinking science intervention. And I'll let Erin take it from here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emily, for laying that foundation of who we are, who are these, crazy people talking about science intervention, and then, what are the foundations of this work in general, which is the NGSS. So at InnerOrbit, being an assessment platform, one of our main missions is to make the NGSS accessible for teachers and students. And that's where our company was really founded, is we found, a big need of high quality phenomena-driven 3D assessments. So in this work over many years, when we've lived in this assessment world, intervention is something that comes up all the time. And when we think about intervention, we can think about science intervention kind of in two big buckets, or this Venn diagram. And there's things that we know, right, about science instruction best practice. And we also have things that we know about general intervention best practice, regardless of the subject. So, in the world of science instruction, we know that best practices include, but are not limited to, right, phenomena-driven learning, productive struggle, student sense making, as Emily shared there with our 3 dimensions, and then also collaborative discourse. So, when we see science instruction coming to life in the fullest, it includes these best practices. Then we still know that students are going to struggle. There's going to be students that are not have gaps in either the DCI or SEP or CCC or other things as well. And so we know there's a huge pool of literature about what intervention best practices can include. Things like having immediate feedback on progress, or having targeted support for misconceptions from data, or even having additional opportunities for discussion and reasoning to make sure students are understanding and have, times to clear up some of those misconceptions. And then also that intervention really should be responsive to what students, are laying down, and the educators to be able to pick that up and then respond to what they're seeing. So as we're living in this science assessment world, we are seeing, amazing best practices in science instruction. We also know that there's deep practice documented for intervention, but we're so curious to think about what is the overlap of those two. So really, what does science intervention look like pulling those two worlds together? And as we're talking with all our amazing, educators who are also thinking about these ideas, we are really seeing this big need that strong science instruction and strong intervention share many goals, but classroom realities can make it difficult to provide targeted support while maintaining 3D sense making, that there was this kind of like give and pull or give and take about these two worlds coming together. So we'd love to hear from you, because we've talked to many educators. We also have, so many on the call today. And when we're kind of addressing this idea of like, what does science intervention look like for you in your context, we would love for you to be able to share what would make science intervention more accessible for you and for your students. As you think about these two worlds colliding and your, maybe implementation of intervention in your context, what would make an intervention like more doable for you and your educators? Feel free to select all that apply with this poll. All right, so it looks like our top response was more intervention resources. So happy you're here today. We're talk about those and think about what they look like. But I definitely can see in the other responses too, like more time in class to implement, and then assistance with differentiation are also super important as well. So even when we're thinking about that biggest barrier of intervention resources, how can we make sure those are doable within class time? Great question. And then also, how can we make sure they're differentiated enough that they are really meaningful to provide the intervention that's needed for kiddos? Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing kind of your context and your insights of what science instruction, or science intervention rather, looks like in your context and what would make it more accessible for you. It's super helpful to know. So let's kind of keep digging into this journey, because I kind of started this initial story here of, we're an assessment company, we provide a rich data. Educators ask us all the time about intervention, but what does intervention really mean for science? So let's kind of pull back some of those onion layers to really define what is intervention and then what could it look like for science. So our definition that we work with at InnerOrbit for intervention is that intervention is a formal process for providing students in need of support with instruction or resources beyond what might be found in curricular and classroom lessons. We also recognize that there's many different structures for intervention out there. So there's 3 that we see commonly used. So the first is multi-tiered systems of support, also known as MTSS. And this is a large framework that is driven from data that provides support services through screening, tiered supports, and progress monitoring. We've also seen intervention be used in more of a positive behavioral intervention and support framework. So, which is really kind of the social emotional lens of the MTSS, that we can provide students different things for different needs in terms of their social emotional lives as well. And then we also know intervention also comes to life in this third and final framework called RTI, response to intervention, which is a more academic focused approach to provide early, systemic, and appropriately intensive supplemental instruction to students at risk. So all that meaning to say, there's a lot of alphabet soup out there when it comes to intervention. But one thing we know they all have in common, which is the foundation of how we think about intervention, is that there are different responses for different groups of kids who might need different things. So the tiered response model, as you can see in this image, is the one that we'll be using in our conversation today. That when we think of tier 1 intervention, that is our whole class research-based core instruction. and that we're looking to reach the most amount of kids through our core instruction, through our curricular research-based resources, have as many of our students meet those needs. And if a majority of our students are still not meeting expectations or goals, tier one instruction, needs to be revised. However, when we look at success past tier one intervention, we can think about tier two. And tier two is when we're seeing targeted small group interventions for at-risk students. And what that looks like is supplemental support for some students based on specific needs. And for me, when I was an educator, this is really where like the carts kind of fell off the wagon, is I was like, well, I can see that like these kids need help, but I'm not really sure with what really specifically to help them move the needle. And then what could I even do to help this group of kiddos like move the needle as well? And then the final tier is tier three intervention. So this is individualized intensive intervention. And in some models, this is where special ed services could come in or feed into. But this is also where really specific support is needed intensively for really specific students. So we'll discuss the tier one, tier two, and tier three model in terms of science intervention as we go throughout today. And when we think about intervention, not only can we think about these different systems or models, but it's really important for us to see what is intervention, what does it look like beyond that core instruction, beyond that tier one. So a slippery slope that we sometimes see educators think about or fall into, and I definitely was in this camp as well, is that intervention can be similar to remediation. And there's all these different terms that kind of circle around this idea of intervention, remediation being one of them, because it is reteaching information that has been previously introduced or, skills or concepts. However, the main difference of what an intervention resource should look like is they should be strategically designed and targeted to meet specific student content or skills. So they should be targeted and they should be strategically designed to support students who have those gaps. So what that looks like is when you are looking at intervention resources, as I think we could see in the poll that, that's a really high need, there are many strategies that you should be looking for in those resources to really make sure that they are strategically designed to target those missing skills. So those strategies can include making sure the intervention resource provides opportunities for students to activate prior knowledge to build upon. Another intervention strategy, and also something you look for in intervention resources, is chunking. So how does the resource take a really complex task or lesson and make it accessible in smaller chunks? Intervention strategies can also include scaffolding, so adding like templates or graphic organizers to make a big, even if it's just a chunk of a large task or activity, doable and achievable through breaking down the processes or giving supports that are gradually removed over time. Additionally, and I feel like this one's missed a lot, is the importance of productive discourse in guided talk moves or discussion strategies for students to have that additional thinking and processing through conversation to see if it's not only helpful for the educator to see what misconceptions are missing, but it's also helpful for the kids to kind of work through misconceptions as well. Additionally, having student choice is really helpful and motivational in intervention too, to have students feel like they have ownership and power over the things that they're learning. Including multimodal representations of learning is also really helpful in intervention strategies. So I know I mentioned discourse as one vehicle, but another mode could also include writing, drawing, all these other different types of representation. So kids can process information in a couple different ways or ways that mean the most to them. And then also metacognitive reflection. So intervention can sometimes feel like a long journey, especially for a lot of kids. So if there's moments of celebration that they're able to reflect on, I learned I first was struggling with this one thing, and now here's what I understand about this one thing, I can then celebrate the journey and the successes that I've been on. So intervention can also include that reflection times to then feed into celebrating success. And that kind of creates this flywheel that when kids have a chance to reflect on things they've learned, they can then celebrate, and then that promotes risk-taking moving forward in other types of either whole class situations or in future intervention sessions, that they can build upon that success and then promote more risk-taking in those environments. So this is not an extensive list, and we'd really love to hear from you as well. Which of these strategies for intervention have you had the most success with? Select all that apply. And then we would also love to hear in the chat, are there any other strategies you have seen work well? Cool. Well, thanks for sharing that poll, Emily. It looks like scaffolding is one of the highest resources there, which is really great. And then we have chunking as a nice follow-up to that too, and then some activating prior knowledge. Beautiful. Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing that. Ooh, this is another good question in the chat, and I think we have a moment to hit on it too. So some of these strategies feel like simply teaching strategies that we use in our core lessons for all students. And how might this be different from intervention? It's a really great question. My quick response, because I feel like we could have a whole webinar about this, is the principle of universal design for learning. So when you think about what strategies might be used to support specific kiddos who are struggling, so like that's where our minds are right now with intervention. So for example, like activating prior knowledge, right? This idea of universal design for learning says that strategy, which has been maybe researched and proven to be helpful for a small group of kids, can be helpful for everybody. And so that's what this universal design for learning kind of framework provides, is that some of these strategies, which might be helpful for specific kids, we should actually just include it in our whole instruction because it might be helpful for everyone. So really what I'm saying here in terms of these like strategies, you should definitely use these in your core instruction. We're definitely not saying like only use these in intervention. However, these are intervention strategies where if you're feeling like your supportive kiddos is not getting where they need to be, consider trying another one of these. Or when you're evaluating intervention resources, really make sure that this is high in your checklist because these strategies are so important for not only tier 2 and tier 3, but within the framework of universal design for learning, they really should be provided for all in our core instruction. Great question. Yes. Awesome. Keep those questions coming. Okay. We're going to stop nerding out because we need to be good with time. And let's go into our next piece here. So we've laid this foundation of what intervention kind of looks like from a broad perspective. So now let's start bringing this idea into science. And really, when we're thinking about our lens of InnerOrbit, of what we support educators with, is this moment of intervention is part of this 3A cycle. So intervention is best driven from data. And so that's even when I was like struggling as a classroom educator, I'm like, I feel like this group of kids needs help, but I'm not sure with what. That's one thing with InnerOrbit that we aim to provide our educators with is really high quality, phenomena driven, three-dimensional assessments to build that assess phase, to then give you data in this analyze phase to see how your students are progressing towards proficiency and then where students might need additional support, to then have really clear actions of what interventions can take place to help my kiddos progress further. So because we live in this assessment cycle pretty often, when we started this journey of science assessment, we were really keeping this assess phase and analyze phase of what we already do to support our educators with data in mind. However, if you don't use InnerOrbit and might not have a whole bunch of data, there's still data you can use anecdotally to provide your students with that action intervention support. So what we did is when we were diving into this need our customers were asking about, so like, what does science intervention really look like? We started with data, which is, what I was just saying on the slide before. And we did a large analysis of a lot of the student data we have internally, because being an assessment platform, we're able to pull performance on student data across different performance expectations, across different questions, and analyze them for really, high level global trends. And one thing we found when we were looking through our huge, database of student data is we found an interesting pattern in our one-dimensional, two-dimensional, and three-dimensional questions. So that's what you see up here on the screen. And that's what kind of Emily was talking about is we make the GSS assessments accessible by breaking down three-dimensional questions into 1D questions, 2D questions, and 3D questions. So in that first image that you see there, that's a one-dimensional question. You'll see that the PE is tagged in that little purple MSPS22 bar, but then there's just the DCI. So we can see a certain amount of proficiency on just these one-dimensional questions. But then as we looked at our two-dimensional questions, and again, we'll have a cross-cutting concept two-dimensional question and then an SEP two-dimensional question, we noticed that sometimes the proficiency or the accuracy of these questions drop off. But then sometimes the three-dimensional question proficiency kind of increases too, but is still not the highest answer. And what's fascinating here, so for example, in this data, we can see that students were maybe performing really well with the cross-cutting concept, ability, and change, as you can see in that little green little bar. But then when it came to the SEP question, the SEP two-dimensional question, which was planning and carrying out investigations, proficiency dipped. But then maybe with the three-dimensional question, students were kind of leaning on their cross-cutting concept knowledge, right? So we noticed this interesting pattern that in our two-dimensional questions, we're seeing a dip in student proficiency, which makes sense because when we think about sense making in this journey from one-dimensional knowledge to then three-dimensional proficiency and pulling together knowledge, science and engineering practices, and cross-cutting concepts, the middle step is 2D thinking. So when we were thinking about what science intervention could be, when we saw this data, we hypothesized that we could really support by helping teachers and students start making some of these two-dimensional connections. And when you see this image on your screen, this is an image we love to use to represent the elaborate process of sense making. I put these little arrows here of like showing it's the connections between the DCIs and the SEPs, or the connections between the DCIs and the CCCs. We're like, how could we provide science intervention to target that? So that's kind of where we started, is we saw this large global need in our data around two-dimensional questions. And then when we're thinking about, this framework of sense making, we're like, okay, let's really target in on this two-dimensional support. So we then took an adventure to listen and see what type of science intervention solutions are out there. And there are a lot of science interventions out there, and a lot of them bring a lot of support to educators looking for solutions. We noticed some patterns across different science intervention solutions out there, in the ether that we can all pull from. So we see a lot of adaptive computer programs. Lots of pros and cons there. So adaptive, meaning that the computer can follow student input to then provide the next best step. We also saw a lot of intervention solutions that were really targeted to just individual students. So like they would go on a specific computer program individually as a kiddo and then, engage with some resources there. And then we also saw a pattern that a lot of science intervention solutions, and even a place where I even started as an educator, was really just focusing on content knowledge, which is important because you do need to leverage content knowledge. But what we were seeing in our data, as I said in the slide before, is that it was actually the integration of content knowledge with the practices or the cross-cutting concepts that students are struggling with the most. So as we were looking through these intervention solutions, we were hearing about a lot of possible limitations from our educators. So the first one was that when educators are using maybe some adaptive computer-based program, they were able to identify, wrong answers, but educators were seeing, but like there's deeper reasoning or sense making that students are struggling with that program was necessarily not supporting kids with. Also, with the solitary student experience for science intervention, we heard a lot of educators say that students would get frustrated, have maybe some more like behavioral tendencies too when doing that because there wasn't a whole lot of support. They were just kind of working independently. And then also with that 1D focused, educators are finding that just reteaching facts or vocabulary didn't help strengthen that three-dimensional process of sense making. So this is where we're taking a stab at this as InnerOrbit and trying to really reimagine what science intervention could be. So what our proposal for science intervention that you all will see from here is that science intervention maybe could be teacher facilitated to lean on the expertise of our educators to really respond to the complexities that students are showing in their thinking. The science intervention can also be collaborative. As we know, sense making and even, science teaching and learning is a collaborative experience. How can intervention also be that? And then, as I mentioned before, how could we really lean into that one step of really incorporating content with the practices and the cross-cutting concepts to have intervention be more two-dimensional? So what you're going to see in our intervention activities beta is that a lot of student thinking is being probed and guided and redirected in real time. So like leveraging that teacher expertise in the intervention session or activity. We promote a lot of idea discussion through these activities so ideas can be discussed, challenged, and refined together. And then finally, you'll see a big focus on integrating the SCPs and the cross-cutting concepts, because that's really what we're going to take the lens here is focus on layering in another dimension to the content. So with all of that foundation of like, what do we know about intervention practices in general? What does InnerOrbit see from our positionality of, science assessment, science student data? This is what we have produced. And in these 3 months, so March, April, and May, we are going through a beta season where we are showing some ideas of how science intervention could come to life in your classroom, and specifically addressing some of those challenges and opportunities that I shared in the previous slides. So within this beta season, we have created a handful of two-dimensional intervention activities for this beta time, and we need your feedback. feedback. We are seeking educators who are interested in trying them out in their classroom and then providing some really helpful insights. And the main focus of what these intervention activities look like is they are specifically focused on single performance expectations. They are teacher facilitated activities, and they've been designed to help bridge that gap between thinking and 2D integration, which is that stepping stone towards through true 3D sense making. When we're thinking about the design of these intervention activities, we knew we wanted them to be collaborative. We knew we want them, of course, to be phenomena driven. We also knew that we wanted to incorporate all of those great intervention strategies and best practices. So we're trying to figure out, like what's the best framework for designing these activities. So in our research, we pulled out that 5E model that probably many of you are familiar with, because that is also one of the best practices for science instructional design. So our design of intervention activities, we wanted to include those 5E moments throughout the intervention activity itself. So in the intervention teacher facilitated small group activity, there'll be an engage moment where we're going to present an accessible problem or situation, kind of like this hook, with a do now question to activate prior knowledge. So really we want to give kids an easy, interesting example of a problem or situation that they'll need to use that SEP or CCC with to get their mind thinking about what does patterns look like, or what is the purpose of a model, to get them engaged in the intervention. We'll then move to an explore phase where in a small group setting, or this, we also hear a lot of teachers want to try this as a tier 1 solution as well, where they then transfer from that like problem or situation in the engage to a new phenomenon. And they're going to collaboratively analyze that phenomenon through scaffolded cross-cutting concept and SEP moves that we have built into the activity design. They'll then move to explain that through that scaffolded cross-cutting concept exploration or SEP exploration, they'll then leverage that thinking to then fully explain the phenomenon. So they're like practicing that muscle of sense making, but they've just built up that CCC and SEP, muscle in that explore phase. Then the intervention activity will end with an elaboration where students have a quick metacognitive reflection and celebration of success of things that they now know through the activity. And then having some time at the end to evaluate, either the educator informally evaluating, how the activity went, but also, with InnerOrbit, we are all about assessments. With all of these intervention activities, there's corresponding post-assessments. So you can measure growth from pre-assessment to then post-assessment. So that's what the evaluation would then look like. So if you are new to InnerOrbit, or if you're an InnerOrbiter, in this beta, we have designed activities in those like 5E structures. And actually, Emily here in a moment is going to walk through one to really pull apart what each E looks like. And then that's also where you can look for those intervention strategies that we mentioned before. But as a high level, what we're recommending to our educators during this beta, or even just in general, when to use intervention activities, but we're supporting our InnerOrbiters with these activities as a response to data. So specifically what that looks like is we have a couple of different reports on InnerOrbit, one of which being our assignment report. And what's going to be happening during these 3 months is that there'll be little pop-ups in the reports to notify educators based upon their data if either a majority of their students, so tier 1, or a small group of their students, so tier 2, would benefit from one of these 2D intervention activities based upon the question accuracy of the 2D questions in the assessments they're already giving on InnerOrbit. So we really want to make this assess, analyze, action 3A cycle be really simple. So we're doing that through this beta, through these pop-ups that you can kind of see here on the screen that will recommend saying, hey, based upon some analysis of your data, a 2D intervention activity might work really well. However, if you're not an InnerOrbiter or still building data, these intervention activities could also be used with anecdotal data as well from your classroom. So pretty much anytime you have data or observations about your students and this is the key trigger, that they have a baseline understanding of science content, but are struggling applying the cross-cutting concept of SEP, that's the trigger of okay, so then they need 2D intervention. And that's where, we can try out some of these intervention activities from InnerOrbit. We're also seeing, just because we know it's a test prep season for a lot of folks are wanting to use intervention activities as maybe review before an assessment. So looking back through a unit saying, okay, kids struggled with this one performance expectation. I want to get them ready for, a larger assessment down the road. These 2D intervention activities would also be good in that season too. All right, fantastic. And one way that you can explore these intervention activities without, having data on InnerOrbit is that we have a resource, and I think we're including it in our follow-up email from our webinar today, where you can just explore the intervention activities we've made during this beta. So there's links to different PEs and different topics from middle school and high school that you can dive into and just use that based upon your anecdotal data where you see kids needing support. And just a little note here, because this is a beta release, we're gathering a lot of feedback during the season. We're just starting with these small set of PEs for educators to try this spring. More activities might be published throughout the spring, ending in May, but not every PE is going to be developed during this beta phase because we're needing to gather lots of feedback from amazing educators like you all. So let's dive into what could science intervention actually look like. And the frame we'll use that is we're going to share one of our 2D intervention activities that we've developed during this beta time. Emily's going to walk through that. And I really want you to have that critical lens on of where do I see those best practices for intervention coming to life in this example. So passing it to you, Emily.
Thank you so much, Erin, for doing such a fabulous job, kind of just laying the groundwork of the thought process behind this beta. I don't know if you can tell, but the team has given so much care and so much thought into these intervention activities, betas, and how we can support our partners and science educators more. So, like Erin said, go ahead and put on your evaluation cap as we kind of look through this, and please we'll have a moment to share some feedback here at the end, but as you have thoughts, feel free to drop them in the chat. So the example that I picked for us to go through today is MSLS 2-1, so middle school life science, and I decided to look at the SCP focused path. So as Erin mentioned, these intervention activities are performance expectation focused, and there's an SCP path and a CCC path. So depending on which dimension your students are struggling with, we have an SCP and a CCC option. So one thing that I wanted to highlight with you right from the get-go is with every single one of these intervention activities, we have a few resources that we have created to help both teachers and students. The first of which is a teacher guide. So in the InnerOrbit team, most of us are former educators, we've been in the classroom, and we tried to create a resource that was really easy and simple to kind of capture and read in order to figure out how to facilitate this activity. We also just tried to make it really user-friendly where you could just kind of jump in and use it as well. But we wanted to be able to provide enough resources if people wanted it. So there's a teacher guide, and there's also a student note catcher. Now, these intervention activities can be given on InnerOrbit, and they also can be done virtually on InnerOrbit. So students can actually enter their responses on the website, but we also provided a paper note catcher that can be printed in case that is an accessibility issue with certain students, or if you wanted a little bit more of that collaborative environment with having paper in front of them as well. So these are two things that are provided for every single intervention activity is the teacher guide and that student note catcher. So let's go ahead and actually dive into what this looks like. So as Erin mentioned, we use that 5E model when designing these intervention activities. So all of these are going to start with that engage, kind of kicking us off. And we're going to do that by presenting students with a phenomena, because at the end of the day, we really want that novel phenomena to still be at the center of intervention, because that's at the center of three-dimensional sense-making assessment. So students are going to be initially prompted about the activity, and they're going to be assured that this is not a quiz or a test. In fact, all of the answers to all of the questions within the activity do not go into our data reports. So this isn't going to influence or affect any data, and students won't get a grade for this either. So this is truly just an activity in order for students to practice, but then you as the teacher can also see their responses too. And I'll show you that here in a little bit. So within this phenomena, students are being asked about their favorite snacks and orangutans. And the SCP focus of this particular intervention activity is all about analyzing and interpreting data. So embedded within the phenomena, there's a ton of graphs. So we've got figure 1 here. They're also going to reference figure 2. They're going to reference figure 3. There's a map. So students are really going to be prompted to interact with that data because the SCP in this case is analyzing and interpreting data. So once they're presented with that phenomena, then they're also going to be presented with a do now. And the idea with the do now is this is supposed to help engage students and give them a really low stakes entry into the activity. So, for example, we've got a nice picture of an orangutan, and then we've got a picture of an oil palm farm. And so, the idea here is these two images show parts of the same region under different conditions over time. What do you notice in each image? So, low stakes, easy entry point. It's just starting to get students like cooking and thinking about what's going on. And then the do now eventually progresses. So, what questions do you have about organisms and resources? What data would you need to answer one of those questions? So again, low stakes entry, but we're starting to get prime their brain a little bit into what we're going to be getting into. After the do now, the next part of the activity is going to be all about activating prior knowledge. As we know, this is one of the best practices when it comes to intervention strategies. So not only are you priming students' brains for information that they're going to need to know in order to do this activity and also just in general to be successful with the performance expectation. It also will give you data and information on how your students are doing with that prior knowledge. So for example, here, students are going to be given a data set and they're simply going to be asked to circle the independent variable and underline the dependent variable. So again, this is that middle school performance expectation. We're talking about analyzing, interpreting data. So let's just see if our students remember independent and dependent variable. And if they don't, then that's a good note to you as a teacher that that might be something you might need to review to help support them with this particular SCP. We do include a handful of activating prior knowledge questions. For the sake of time, I won't show them all to you. But what I did want to really highlight is the next within the intervention activities, which is explore. And this is all about collaboratively analyzing a situation through scaffolded SCP moves. So this explore phase is actually broken down further into a think, pair, share. So think, as you probably are aware, is all about students kind of independently trying to process and think about what's going on at first. So we're asking them to go back to the phenomena, go back to those graphs, and what variables do you see and how does it change over time? So again, we're starting to scaffold this idea of analyzing, interpreting data. We're not asking them to like identify the trend, if it's positive, if it's negative, just what are the variables? And is it changing? And then from there, we're asking them the same thing about the other graph. And then we're trying to get at this idea of like, is there a pattern between these two graphs? So now that we kind of had you like zoom out and look at these independently, can you now see if there's any similarities between them? And then from there, do you think there's a relationship that could be occurring between these resource-related conditions and their orangutan population? So this is all, again, in that explore. And this is all in the think. So students are doing this independently on their own. Then from there, we're going to then go into the pair portion of the explore, where then we're going to give students an opportunity to collaborate with one another. And what I really like about this is it really scaffolds what we want this pair moment to look for. I don't know about all you, but there was absolutely moments in my classroom where I'm like, okay, think about this and then talk to your neighbor about it. And sometimes they would just look at each other and be like, I don't know what to say. So what I really like about this is it kind of breaks down, like share your explanation from question 12, compare your evidence with question 10, and then can you guys together with like what you came up with, can you come up with a stronger explanation? Like, can you like combine your powers and come up with something a little bit better? And then from there, then they can go ahead and go even further with this. So then, like, how does this new source strengthen, weaken, or complicate your Part A claim? And again, they're doing this as a pair. So they've got somebody to talk with, somebody who might have noticed something that they didn't, while we're starting to get deeper into the actual SCP of analyzing and interpreting data. And then think, pair, share. And this part I love too. So this one is where, again, we really wanted this to be a teacher-facilitated activity because our teachers are the experts. They know what's going on with their students. They know what's happening. And this is a great chance for you to bring the group together and say, okay, what have we come up with claims? You know, if you've been walking around the room, maybe you've heard some like really awesome insights from one group and you can call that out. You can call out any differences that groups are having. And then you as the teacher can probe additional thinking. So if some students have this one thought, you can be like, can you tell me more about that? Or what made you think about that? And that's something that's kind of lacking in that solitary experience is you're just seeing students' answers and they're just marking them right or wrong. Where here we can really dig into and see like, oh, I see how you came up with that. There might actually be a different way to like look at this. So this is where that share and the teacher kind of bringing all this together is where that teacher expertise really comes into play. Now we're into the explain phase. So we did engage, we did explore with a think, pair, share, and now we're going to explain. So what's great about this is after we had this big share out session that the teacher facilitated, now students have had that scaffolding with the SEP, and now here's their chance to bring it all together. So students here are given two different claims, claim A and claim B, and they're being asked to choose the one that's best supported by the data. So now the teachers has had an opportunity in order to see what's going on with the students. They've helped maybe like refine any misconceptions and guide their thinking. So now students can go ahead and on their own write an explanation for how the data supports these individual claims. And then from there, we go into the elaborate, which is guiding students through a metacognitive reflection and to celebrate success. What I really love about this is a lot of times students are just doing things and taking that moment just to pause and to think and be like, like where did I start? Where am I ending? Do I still have questions? Does this make sense to me or not still? So this gives students a second to just ponder on their learning that they can maybe hopefully then use and leverage in future situations. And again, all of these are not scored, all of these are not graded, but you as the teacher will have the opportunity to look back on all of these student responses in order to decide next steps, which once the intervention activity is done. So once you've gone through these 5 E's, there's a few different things that you as the teacher then can do. You can first go back and review those student submissions. So remember, one of the parts of this was activating prior knowledge. So you can actually go through and see how did students do on those prior knowledge questions. If you've got a high percentage rate, that's great. A couple students missed it. Maybe you check in with those students and make sure that they understand the prior knowledge that they need in order to move forward. The other thing you can do is you can actually go back and read some of the student responses. And just between you and me, I had the opportunity to read some of these just like within our InnerOrbit database, and it has been so cool to see students thinking in their thought process, like going through these different activities. Because this is that moment where you can be like, they got that, like they got it, they get it. Or you can be like, oh, okay, maybe we need a little bit more tweaking here. So this is where you can see what happened during the activity, and then you can go from there. And then from there, InnerOrbit will go ahead and suggest creating a post assessment. So especially if you did this intervention activity as a response to data, InnerOrbit suggested that an intervention activity might be worthwhile due to how students did on 2D questions. So now you can go from there and create a post assessment. And was there growth? Did they improve with the SEP? Did they improve with the CCC? How are my students doing on these questions now that we did this intervention activity together? Thank you so much for going with me as I kind of walked through that example. Hopefully that gave you a little bit of a better idea of actually what these look like and how it could actually look in your classroom. I know we are nearing the hour. We took a little bit longer than we intended, but we appreciate it. And all of your questions have been fabulous. So between you and me, I think it's been worth it. But what I wanted to go ahead now is just talk about some potential next steps in case you're interested in exploring this further. So if you're here with us today and you are a current customer, the first thing you can do is go into your data reports and see if an intervention activity has been suggested. So you can go into your assignments report, and if that little pink bubble is there, it's already offering an intervention activity for you based on your data. So maybe it's already happened with something that you've given before. Another thing you can do is you can go ahead and build and assign an assessment using one of the PEs that we have intervention activities for, and see if you get that pink bubble suggestion after giving it to your students. And as always, you can reach out to your account manager at any time with questions about how you would potentially want to incorporate this with what you're currently doing with InnerOrbit now. Current pilots. So if you're currently piloting and trying out InnerOrbit right now, it's a real similar suggestion. You can go ahead and see if any intervention activities have already been suggested within your data reports. You can go ahead and build and assign an assessment using the PEs we have intervention activities for, and see if you get suggested to use one. And you can also reach out to your district engagement manager with questions. Potential future pilots. So if you are currently not using InnerOrbit, either in a pilot or as a customer, and you are interested, Erin is going to go ahead and drop in the chat again our pilot interest form. This is not a commitment. You are essentially telling us you are interested. What this is going to do is this is going to trigger somebody from our team to reach out to you and talk to you about what piloting could look like and talk to you about some next steps with that. We can do really large pilots, like so we can do like a district wide, like get everybody involved in trying it. We can also do tiny pilots where it's just one teacher exploring the site on their own. So there really is a large scale of how we can do this, and the interest form will help guide you through that. And like I mentioned, if you fill that out, somebody from our team will reach out to you ASAP. And no pressure, but we would love your help to help us shape these science intervention solutions. Again, we put a lot of time and thought and energy into this, but we're not the ones in the classroom right now using this, you would be. So we really want to hear from you if this meets your needs, and if it doesn't, how it could. So one thing that we will leave you with is if you are a current customer or if you're currently piloting, we do have a help article ready to go about the intervention activities. So if you need to get into some of the nitty gritty of like, wait, where do I find them? Or how does this work again? I know Emily mentioned something about this in the webinar. We've got this nice help article, and we'll go ahead and email this to you too when we email you the recording of the webinar. Also, when you are on our site and you look at the intervention activities, you're going to notice these little emoticons on the little love hearts and the meh face and the sad face. This is where you can provide feedback on our site to how the intervention activities are going. So you click one of the emoticons, and then from there, it's going to give you a text box where you can expand further on your feedback. So please, 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 if you have given an intervention activity or you plan to, please share your feedback with us, because we really, really want to, this is a beta, right? So we are trying this out and we want to know how it's going and what we can do differently. Which leads me to my next question. And honestly, I haven't been paying too much attention to the chat because otherwise I'm going to forget what words are coming out of my mouth. But I think great questions have already been being asked. But I'm curious, what are your initial impressions of these beta intervention activities as a potential solution for science innovation? Do you think this could work in your classroom? If you don't think it could, why wouldn't it? We would love to hear what your current thoughts are. And they can be as simple or as detailed as you would like. And even if you haven't tried them, please feel free to share your initial impressions. So what do you think of this as a potential solution for science intervention? So please, we want your honest feedback. Go ahead and start dropping in the chat what your initial impressions are if you have not already done so. And with 1 minute over, we'll go ahead and wrap this up. So just to talk about some of the key things, this really came from this idea that classroom realities can make it really difficult to provide that targeted support for three-dimensional sense making. So science instructional best practices and best practices for intervention don't always mesh well together. Erin talked us through some amazing intervention strategies and different ways that these could look like. And we also did our best to incorporate a lot of these strategies into our intervention activities beta, which are teacher facilitated, collaborative activities that focus on SCP and CCC integration to help support 3D science intervention. Again, we'll go ahead and drop the pilot interest form in the chat. If you are interested in trying out InnerOrbit, please go ahead and fill that out. Again, it's not a commitment. You're just letting us know that you're interested, and we'll reach out to you about potential next steps. Feel free to check out our YouTube channel at any point. We post tons of videos much like this. And you can also email us at any point at inquiries@innerorbit.com if you have any further questions. We will go ahead and hang out here in the chat for a few more minutes in case there's other questions, in case you want to share any more of your initial impressions about these activities. So we will be here in order to answer that and to see what people are saying. But thank you so much for your time. It has been a pleasure working and speaking with all of you, and please reach out if you need anything.